take it away.
Thank you. I'm really thrilled to be in the midst of this celebration, exploration, investigation of the city. I want to start with a quote from Gandhi. I regard the growth of cities as an evil thing, unfortunate for mankind and the world. And with all due respect to the great man, on this one, I think he was completely and utterly wrong. Because, in fact, when you think about the transformation of India, when you think about pathways out of poverty into prosperity, it's not about rural villages, homespun fabric. It's about Bangalore, it's about Mumbai, it's about Kolkata, it's about Gargaon, it's about places that are being conduits of information, conduits of knowledge, conduits of opportunity across continents and civilizations. These are cities that are transforming the world. As Tony Hsieh reminded us this morning, in 2007, the UN declared that humanity was more than 50% urban. And it's hard on net not to think that that's a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urban to those countries that are less than 50% urban, the more urbanized countries have, on average, incomes that are 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Now, one way to see this, the rising urbanization of the world, is with this type of chart, which is a way of thinking about what's happened to countries by income levels. What I've done is I've split up the poorer countries in the world based on their incomes. These are all in 2010 dollars. And I've just shown you the share of countries that are more than 1/3 urbanized. The 1/3 level is just a relatively arbitrary way of saying, look, is this a moderately urban place? So what does this mean? So look at 4,000 and 5,000. The blue line is 1960, the red line is 2010. What those lines show is that if you had per capita earnings between $4,000 and $5,000 in modern earnings, whether in 1960 or in 2010, about 80% of those countries were more than 1/3 urbanized. The typical country in this income block was primarily urban, and the same thing was true between $3,000 and $4,000 per capita. Those countries were generally not 100% urban, but they were 40%, 50% urban. Now, go down to the poorer countries, countries earning less than $1,000. Now, today, there's a bar there, but look at 1960, and that's not a typo. In 1960, there was no such thing as a country with a per capita income of less than $1,000 that was more than 1/3 urban, right? To be poor was to be rural, as had been true throughout almost all of human history. Look again at between 1,000 and 2,000. 20% of these countries were more than 1/3 urban in 1960. 60% were today. This is on one level an enormous opportunity. On the other hand, it creates enormous challenges, and that's one of the themes of my talk here today, is that there are tremendous assets that come with urbanization, but there are also demons that come with density. Now, this fact is not meant to hide the fact, not meant to in any sense confuse us, that the relationship between income and urbanization is as strong today as it ever has been. For every 10% that a country increases its urbanization rate, its incomes go up on average by 50%. I don't mean to suggest a causal relationship there, but that correlation is as strong as it's ever been in the past. And of course, that's true within countries as well. This is a picture of America, and what I've done is I've taken the 3,000 odd counties in the United States, and I've ordered them on the basis of their density level. Because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. What the bottom line shows is the relationship between density and income levels. The densest tenth of America's counties have incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is what economists call agglomeration economies, and these effects survive any number of complex statistical tasks. The top line shows something that's perhaps somewhat more surprising, which is the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and initial population density levels. And what you can see is that whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. This is something of a puzzle. Of course, the cyberseers and the techno-prophets told us 20 years ago that the death of distance would make face-to-face contact and the cities that enable that contact obsolete. That has not happened. I believe very strongly that that is a result of the fact that what globalization and new technologies have done is they have radically increased the returns to being smart. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. Right? It is our greatest asset. Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject, it's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. Right? And we have evolved over millions of years to have these cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. That's why Google, instead of telling all of its people to work from home, builds the Googleplex, right? And buys more than 1 million square feet in downtown New York. It's why Marissa Mayer requires her workers to show up. urban poverty, right? It is often argued that the inequities of cities are somehow or other a sign of the damning of cities. I submit to you that, in fact, the opposite is true. Cities attract poor people and rich people because they're good places to be poor relatively and relatively good places to be rich. The favelas of Rio reflect the fact that the cities of Brazil offer much more economic opportunity than the rural Northeast did. And if you try to compare your life with those of a slum dweller in Mumbai, unquestionably it looks awful. But that's not the right comparison. You have to compare that with rural India. And in that comparison, in fact, Mumbai looks pretty good. I'm going to skip that. One way that we actually can measure this is by looking at self-reported happiness levels across space. In the wealthy world, there's no self-reported happiness level difference between urban and rural areas. What self-respecting New Yorker is going to tell a surveyor that they're so pleased with their life, for goodness sakes? But in poorer countries, the gap between urban and rural happiness is quite large. So positive lines show that people who live in urban India say that they are much more satisfied with their lives than people who live in rural India do. There are, of course, some places in which rural life dominates. Iraq, and this data was done in about 2005 to 2007, rural Iraqis did say they were more happier than urban Iraqis did during this time period, which may not be too surprising. This is from recent work of mine on happiness across the USA. New York is incredibly low in terms of self-reported happiness levels. Of course, New York is also incredibly low in terms of suicide levels. So you have to interpret whether or not this is cultural or real. More generally, there is no relationship between metropolitan area population and happiness across the US. There is a relationship between population decline and happiness, but if you go back to data for the 1940s, the places like Scranton that are both unhappy and declining now, they were unhappy in the 1940s too, right? And it looks more as if population is fleeing unhappy places rather than that people are unhappy because of the decline. Now, cities are strong because of the idea flows that move easily across dense areas, but they are weak, they're troubled, because just as it is easy for a new piece of knowledge to hop from one person to the other, it is also possible to pass a disease, right? We see this right now in the Ebola epidemic in Africa, right? And cities for thousands of years have been trying to deal with the demons of density, the most important of which is contagious disease, and the most important weapon against that is clean water, right? Because there's no more important job of city government than making sure the water people drink is free from disease. But this is also about congestion. This is also about crime. These are all challenges that cities must face. There are reasons why people in New York like government more than people in Montana do. They need it more, right? Because with density requires management. Now, this in some sense is the problem facing this poor urban world, a world that is both lacking financial resources, and then that was the graph I skipped, lacking competent government as well. As a result, it's rare that we have easy options. It's just a question of what's less bad. Let me give you three options, three trade-offs that we often face. One of which is engineering versus economics. Clean water is best dealt with engineering. Think about the Croton Aqueduct, bringing in clean water to Manhattan. But there is no engineering solution to congestion. You can't just build your way out of traffic jams because of something the economists Turner have found they call the fundamental law of highway traffic. Vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. Right? And unless you actually charge people for the social cost of their action, unless you charge people congestion pricing, as Singapore has done since 1975, right, you cannot get a sane use of roads. A second trade-off, the two great problems with physical building, monumentalism, right, building large structures for no apparent purpose. That was what Tony Hsieh was talking about when he was talking about the Oedipus complex, right, the desire to think that just by building you fix everything, right, versus, of course, NIMBYism, the other curse that should be very familiar here in Northern California. Because in fact, if you want to think about why housing is so expensive here, the fact that you have made it so difficult for people to build is the primary reason for that. Mumbai has also labored under a 1.25 FAR ratio since the 1960s, which means that the city sprawls out instead of building up and is far too expensive for ordinary people. My last trade-off, of course, is this painful, awful trade-off between anarchy and dictatorship, right? You can be Nigeria, in which case your problems don't get solved because the government is dysfunctional and doesn't solve things, or you can be China, in which case you do solve problems, but at a terrible cost to human freedom. And I think the challenge going forward is to figure out a middle path that manages to combine some degree of the authority needed to solve urban problems with a continuing respect for human liberty, which is, after all, the linchpin of urban life. Thank you.
Somebody changing that slide? I thought this was a great sociological talk you gave. I don't know if you know that, but I think that. So I am going to, since he has put out a lot of data that I think that is very important, I want to address a different question. We have a lot of built density around the world. a lot of the language of urbanization encompasses vast stretches of office parks, endless rows of high-rise housing buildings. Is that city? Is that a city? It isn't. Let me just put on the table a definition of the city that would exclude a lot of what we now include under that simpler term, urbanization, especially density. And so for starters, I would say that not all density should be thought of as being the urban. The city is a complex but incomplete system, and in that mixture of complexity and incompleteness lies its enormous capacity to keep reinventing itself across decades, for good or for bad, gentrification not so good maybe sometimes, across centuries, across millennia. So it seems to me that a critical issue about marking out the city is that the city is a place where those without power get to make a history, an economy. Think of immigrant neighborhoods and their sub-economies, a culture. Think of all kinds of poor artists who constitute a cultural domain, many cultural domains. So seen from that perspective, it matters whether it is city or simply density. In an office park, those without power, they don't get to make a history. In fact, you have to have some sort of thing that shows you, that allows you access. So the importance of cityness. Now, two focuses, two little projects that I'm doing, but they're not so little. One is called Who Owns the City? And this is a negative story, I would say, which is the vast amount of investment, national, but now increasingly foreign, that is buying pieces of cities. And I have some slide, if that shows well. Here is the most recent data. Now, New York reigns supreme. The beautiful city next to which we are, San Francisco, is number 5. This covers much more. These top 25 cities account for a very large share. But believe me, it's happening in all countries. Now, what does it mean? By the way, whether it's foreign or national is really secondary from the perspective of the city. There are certain interesting data features about foreign investment that allow you to capture it far more easily than if you're just looking at all domestic investment, especially because they're big. But why does it matter that a big developer comes in, buys up all pieces, big chunks of urban land, builds a mega project? Well, it eliminates street tissue, it eliminates little squares, it eliminates that which constitute the urban cityness, that which allows, again, I repeat, those without power to also make a history. So, and I would argue also it de-urbanizes the city. Now, here are some other sort of figures. Manhattan, this is a bit older data, and Manhattan now, of course, has become the destination for a lot of Chinese, Kazakhstan, it's sort of become one of the key destinations. The Chinese just bought Atlantic Yards, basically, a huge patch of land, industrial manufacturing, etc. And they are going to build 14 huge apartment complexes. That raises the density, but does it take away something of what that bunch of neighborhoods that are in that zone? I think it is, in many ways, a negative. And I just mentioned Chinese because they just did this, and it's a big event. Here are some sort of more detailed figures. As you can see, New York, the metro area, $55 billion. Now, the other feature about these top 25 cities is that 70% of that foreign investment is for offices. And the rest is, to a very large extent, for apartment buildings. So they are sort of reshaping in a very significant way, I would argue, the question of the city. Here I have this is another distribution, but I'm going to move on. Here you see the many different, again, I'm going to leave these slides, so, divided by the kinds of uses, and different cities come in play. The other thing that is very interesting are, if you want, the specialized differences among cities, what goes where, etc. My second here is more, this, by the way, is a distribution that is about to change, certainly in the case of Canada being replaced by a lot of Asian investors. The Asian investors are loving the United States right now, because of course China is a bit in trouble, Latin America is unstable, the Europeans don't know where they're going, so there is a lot more coming. Again, I repeat, this is not a story simply about foreign capital, it's just that foreign investment tells a certain kind of tale, and it is easier to track than domestic investment. So I just want to put that on the table. Now, my second project makes the most of the city, I would say, or aspires to detect how we can make the most of the city on the environmental vector. My starting point, again, is a bit of a provocative statement, and it is that the current policy space for addressing the environmental question is getting us nowhere. And in my expulsions book, I have a lot of data to show that. And so the basic argument is that the city has the capacity within it to operate way beyond the space of policy. I think good policy is very important, and I loved what Nogueira said about good policy, but in the case of the environmental question, we've got to take it much further than existing policy, and I think there's a lot of data that documents that. So the way I'm working it is knowledge vectors that connect certain features of the city with biological capacities, material science, certain types of engineering. Every surface in a city should be working. Right now, there's a lot that is not working. Roads could, take in, absorb through voltaics and all kinds of other technologies, solar power. When we walk in our houses, we generate energy. Biology, there's a whole bunch of, most biologists, of course, are zero interested in cities. I mean, they're just like scientists, they do their stuff. But there are certain groups that are. So for instance, one very recent discovery, a bacterium that if you put it in brown organic waters, which is what we generate collectively in kitchens, bathrooms, restaurants, etc., it actually produces a molecule of a plastic, durable, resistant, but biodegradable. That means, ipso facto, recoding a negative for cities, a burden. They don't know how to dispose it. The United States is famous for not knowing. Golf courses, that suddenly explode because they have stored all of that there. And it means that the city can actually be an exporter of the final product, that plastic that is durable, resistant, but biodegradable, plastic being a big issue, both in the sense that we use it in so many things, and in the sense that it is at the heart of a lot of environmental destruction, especially with ocean waters, etc. So it can export either the plastic, or it can export the raw material. A city like Copenhagen is doing it. A bacterium that if you put it on concrete surfaces, concrete, not this beautiful, plaster, but concrete. As it lives its little life, it deposits a calcium that seals off the surface. And eventually, with time, the temporality of the biosphere is really different from our temporality, actively purifies the air around it. Now, those are just two examples. There are many, many more. So that means that you actually reactivate surfaces in cities for the larger project that is environmental protection. And, more discoveries are happening all along. So on the one hand, the story of who owns the city. When I look at all this foreign investment and national investment into big patches of land, I ask myself, what are they buying? Are they buying buildings, or are actually buying urban land? And very often it's pretty ambiguous. How do you buy urban land? You buy it via buildings, or via such setups as Atlantic Yards. But on the other hand, the city as this extraordinary underutilized space for all kinds of deployments of scientific discoveries, engineering innovations, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.